Welcome to this presentation on invoicing and tax. My name is Carrie Bartels, and I'm a trainer with Ex Libris North America. This presentation is copyrighted and is the confidential property of Ex Libris Limited. Information included in this presentation is periodically reviewed and updated. You may share these training materials within your institution, but not beyond. During this session, we'll be focusing on the tax options that are available in invoices, as well as taking you through some scenarios using the different options. Now, because this topic is specifically about invoicing and the options for applying taxes to invoices, it is recommended that you view the sessions that are listed here, and particularly the invoicing workflow session prior to viewing this one. Just for reference purposes, this table identifies the roles for staff operators who perform invoicing-related functions. And the roles were covered more in depth during the invoicing workflow session, but they're just listed here as a refresher. The key objectives for this session are to understand the options for adding taxes into an invoice, and then ultimately be able to include taxes in invoices as appropriate. So let's go ahead and look at the different options. We are going to look at 6 tax options within the Alma invoices, and so those would be inclusive, exclusive, line exclusive, expended from fund, VAT per invoice line, and then lastly, governmental vendor use tax. Just to briefly review invoices before we dive into the tax details, invoices are created from the Alma menu in the acquisitions area. And this is assuming you have an invoicing role in order to see the Create Invoice link. And actually, let's go there now in Alma. So from the Alma menu, you would click on in the Acquisitions area under Receiving and Invoices, or Invoicing rather, Create Invoice. So when you create an invoice, you have 3 different options to create that invoice. You can create it manually and add invoice lines to that invoice from a PO, and from a file, as in an Excel file. So those are the 3 different options for creating invoices. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail because this was covered in the invoicing workflow session, but just as a refresher. The next thing I'm going to do actually is search for an invoice. I'm going to show you an invoice that was already created. So I can do that in one of 2 ways. I can use the quick search box and click on invoices and then type in the invoice number, or from the acquisitions area, I can search for invoice. And I can input the invoice number here. And here is the invoice that I'm interested in. This is in a review status currently. It was manually created. Here's the creation date and the total price of the invoice. I'm going to click on Actions View. And the first thing that we're taken to is the Summary tab of the invoice. This will be the default. The Summary tab, this has details about the invoice up at the top here, so the invoice number, the total amount of the invoice, the vendor and the vendor account, the invoice date, and the total invoice lines amount. And that actually comes from the Invoice Lines tab, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So this is the top portion, the details portion. The second section has to do with additional charges, and that's where you determine if you want any additional charges such as shipping or insurance, whether you want those distributed or, in other words, prorated among each invoice line. So that's where you would indicate that. The third section is a VAT section, and that's used for taxes, and that's what we're going to focus on in just a moment. And then the last section, a payment section, that's if you want to indicate that something was prepaid. The Invoice Lines tab, primarily when you work with an invoice, you'll work with the Summary tab and the Invoice Lines tab. So looking at invoice lines, that indicates each order line that's associated with the invoice. So as well as the cost of each item, here's the total price, the title or description of the item, and then the fund that's going to be used to pay for the item. So that is the Invoice Lines tab. I'm going to click on the back button. And before I actually edit this invoice to show you the different options, I want to take you through entering taxes into the invoice. So focusing now specifically on taxes. After you enter details in the top portion of the summary tab of the invoice itself, you can then enter taxes in this VAT area. And keep in mind that VAT section not only can be used for VAT taxes, but also GST taxes or really any other taxes that might be added to an invoice. Now before you enter the tax information here, one of the first things you might want to do is in the vendor record, make sure that there's a little checkbox, liable for VAT. So that just indicates to Alma that when an invoice is created, it's expected that there will be information added in the VAT area because this vendor is liable for VAT. Let me just show you that very quickly here from the Alma menu. This time under acquisitions, I'm going to vendors. And I'm going to look up a vendor here. And I'll just do actions edit. And notice in the vendor record, here's this liable for VAT checkbox. So that just indicates to Alma that when you're creating an invoice for this vendor, it should expect that there will be VAT information in the VAT section. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this one. Going back to our invoice, invoices. And I'm going to click on Actions, go to Task List, and that will allow me to edit the invoice. And then we have Actions Edit. So the first sections we want to focus on here is the VAT percent and the amount. You can enter either the tax percentage or the tax amount, and Alma will then automatically calculate the other field based on the total amount field. Total amount meaning of the invoice up here at the top. Alternatively, rather than entering this information, you can configure a VAT code to use for entering the percentage. And this is configured in the Alma Acquisitions Configuration menu. You'll have access to that once you complete Alma certification training. Once that's configured, you will then see a VAT code field in this VAT section. When you enter the VAT code, the percentage, the VAT percentage here, will automatically populate based on what you've configured. If it's relevant, you can enter a note in this vendor tax local currency field. And that note would be used to indicate, for example, that tax is charged in local currency, but the invoice itself is in foreign currency. The next thing we're going to look at is this VAT type drop-down. And there are 3 different options that we'll take a look at. I'm going to go back to the slides. And the first option is inclusive. And we're going to focus on that first because this is the default. When you create an invoice, by default, the VAT type drop-down will have inclusive selected. Inclusive means that any taxes are already included in the total amount. So in the case of our invoice here, the total amount of $100 that you see here, that includes taxes. And it's calculated as total price minus total price divided by 1.1. So in this example, using $100 as the total amount, it's calculated as, with a 10% VAT, it's calculated as 100 minus 100 divided by 1.1, and that equals 9.09 rather. So that's how we get to that amount. The second option that we'll talk about in the VAT type dropdown is exclusive. If exclusive is selected from that dropdown, it means that the tax amount needs to be added to the invoice total amount. So in other words, you're just telling Alma that the invoice total amount, in this example of $100, does not include taxes, and that taxes will be added to it. And the calculation for the VAT here, when you select exclusive, it's configured as $10. So 10% of $100 being $10. The last option in the VAT type dropdown is line exclusive. So we'll see that here. This is similar to inclusive in that the invoice total amount includes tax, but the tax amount is calculated outside of the invoice line's total value and is not factored into the individual invoice lines. So if line exclusive is selected, the invoice's total amount includes the VAT, again similar to inclusive, but the invoice line's price does not. And the VAT amount is calculated here above the invoice line's price to give the total amount consisting of the invoice lines plus the VAT amount. So that's a third option. And we're going to be taking a look at scenarios in just a moment here for each of these options. Expended from fund, that's the next option we'll take a look at, and this is a little checkbox in the VAT area of the invoice. This is similar to pro rata, but for additional charges like shipping and insurance. But in this case, it's proration related to taxes. And by default, when you create an invoice, this checkbox will be selected for expended from fund. And if that expended from fund checkbox is selected, that indicates that the tax amount is to be expended from each invoice line's fund. So the tax will be prorated and applied to each invoice line, and we'll see that again when we go to the scenarios. If the expended from fund checkbox is unchecked, so that if this is not selected, it means that the tax amount should be expended from a separate fund as a separate invoice line. And it will show up actually as an adjustment invoice line when we go to the invoice lines tab of the invoice. Another option is VAT per invoice line. And this is a case where perhaps one invoice line has VAT added, but another invoice line within the same invoice does not. So there's a setting that can be configured where you add the VAT or tax per invoice line. So this does require a configuration in the acquisitions configuration menu. So once you've taken Alma certification training, you will have access to that. In the meantime, you may need to work with your Ex Libris project team to configure this. Once the configuration is done, when you create the invoice, you will see a new checkbox, and you'll see that here in the VAT area of the invoice, VAT per invoice line. Select this box if you want to add the VAT, or in other words, the tax, per each invoice line, rather than having the tax distributed amongst all invoice lines in the invoice. So maybe you have one invoice line that requires VAT. Maybe there's another invoice line within the invoice that does not require VAT. So once the checkbox is selected, you'll notice that all of the other fields here, well, actually the VAT percent and the amount, those are disabled because you're going to be adding the actual amounts per invoice line. How you add the invoice, that information to each invoice line is when you go to the Invoice Lines tab and you click on the Add Invoice Lines button. That will create the invoice line details, and you can indicate the PO line that should be that this invoice line is for. Because the VAT per invoice line checkbox is selected, you will see a section in the invoice line details for VAT. So you can indicate either the percent or the amount, either one, and Alma will auto-calculate the other field. And that will be the percent or the VAT percent or amount for this particular line. And if the invoice line doesn't require VAT or amount, just leave these blank. The last option we'll cover is the governmental vendor use tax option. And this is in the case where you need to add or handle tax payments completely separate from regular invoice charges. So this is another example. It's a tax is owed, but it's not billed by the vendor. And instead, the library pays for that tax separately. We'll go through each step in a moment. Just in brief, though, what we'll be doing is creating a governmental vendor record in Alma to receive the use tax for an invoice payment. And just a note that you can only have one governmental vendor record in Alma per institution. That governmental vendor will handle only the use tax on invoices. Just for definition purposes, a use tax represents a tax on the usage of library items, and it's expended from the same funds as the actual invoice charges. Basically, this just ensures that tax payments are handled completely separate from regular invoice charges, and that those taxes go directly to the government. Note that because it's only used for handling use tax invoices, the governmental vendor cannot be selected as a vendor for a PO line or for an invoice. So if you were creating a PO line, you're selecting the vendor for that PO line, you will not be able to select that government vendor. And we're going to take this through step by step. The first step is to create, again, a vendor record that will be our governmental vendor record. So we do this from the Acquisitions menu in the Acquisitions Infrastructure area, and we go to Vendors. I'm actually going to show you this live. And so from the Alma menu here, let me just scroll down. We would click on Vendors. Next thing we would do is click on Add Vendor. And very similar to other vendors that might be in the system, we're going to give this a name. I'm just going to call this Government, give it a code. And notice down here at the very bottom, there's this governmental checkbox. Because this is a governmental vendor, we're going to select that checkbox. When we do that, there's another field that displays, and that's a tax percentage field. So we can indicate the tax percent. When this record is saved, it will be saved as a governmental type of vendor record. And just keep in mind that there can only be one governmental vendor created. And once it's created, the governmental checkbox that you see here will be grayed out, or in other words, not selectable on other vendor records. So this is our one and only government vendor record in Alma. Now, I'm actually going to click on Cancel for this for right now, only because I have some other tax scenarios that I want to show you that do not use the governmental vendor record. So I'm going to click on Cancel. But I just wanted to show you how that government vendor would be created. Notice also when you, before I do that, when you select governmental, that checkbox, liable for VAT is also automatically selected. So I'm going to click on Cancel. Going back to the slides here. Very similar to what we did earlier for any non-governmental vendors, you're just going to want to make sure in the vendor record that that liable for VAT checkbox is selected. And that means that use tax can be paid on this vendor's invoices through the invoice generated by the governmental vendor. We'll be talking more about that in one of the last steps. So that's the second step. The third step is once a governmental vendor record has been established or created, notice that when you create an invoice, so this is creating an invoice now, the VAT section, that displays a little bit differently than previously shown when we went through the different tax options. So just to kind of keep that in mind. In the VAT section here, notice that there's a new checkbox that displays, and that's because we've created a governmental vendor. So we now have a checkbox for Report Tax. So you'd want to select that one. The VAT amount in the percentage fields, those are grayed out or disabled. And if there were values in those fields, those will just zero out. In the VAT type field, you'll want to select exclusive. So this means that the tax will be added on top of the total invoice amount. The invoice is then configured to link to the use tax governmental vendor invoice, and we're going to look at linking next. Just to note that, again, a use tax can be appended to an invoice only if the institution has created that governmental vendor record that we did in step 1. The last step involved in this process, and when the invoice is submitted, it should be in a waiting for payment status or a ready to be paid status. And so the last step then is to run an export job, to export the invoices for payment. And this is done through the general configuration menu in the administration area of Alma. And again, once you have completed Alma certification training, you will have access to this if you have an administrator role. there is a section here, so you would click on Configuration menu and then Integration Profiles. And one of the options that you will have is there's a profile for export invoices for payment. This job can either be scheduled or it can run manually. And when it's run, there's an external system job ID that will be generated after you click on the Run button, for instance. You can also monitor the job in the Monitor a Job area under the Administration section of Alma. So just if you're curious to find out if the job is completed or not, that's one place to check. Let me show you that just real quickly. From the Alma menu under Administration, Monitor Jobs. And that's where you can monitor if the export job has completed or not. What will happen is once that job runs, you can do a search for the invoice, and you'll notice that there are two invoices that you will see. The original invoice, so our original invoice was number 123, plus an invoice with a suffix of RT, and that RT stands for Report Tax. This 123_RT invoice contains only the use tax to be paid on the original invoice. So this original invoice does not include use tax, but this 123_RT, that will just include the use tax. So now that we've covered the different tax options, let's go through some different scenarios, in particular for inclusive, exclusive, line exclusive, and expended from fund. So those options, just to hopefully make them a little clearer. So we are going to be looking at 6 different scenarios here. And for each of these scenarios, we are looking at an invoice that has a total amount of $100 and a tax of 10%. The invoice contains 3 invoice lines, 2 for $25 and the other for $50. So in this first scenario, what we're going to do is we're going to select a VAT type of inclusive, and the expended from fund checkbox will be selected. Just to remind you, the VAT type of inclusive, that means that this total amount of $100 includes tax. If the expended from fund checkbox is selected, as it will be in this scenario, that means that the VAT amount is applied to each invoice line's fund. And in this particular scenario, that it's going to be included in the total price for each item. So that's what we're going to look at first. So we're going to go to Alma, and I'm actually going to show you that invoice we just worked with a little earlier. And I'm going to click on Actions, go to Task List, and that will take me actually to the Review area for invoices. And from there I can click on Actions, Edit. So here's our example again. $100 is the total amount of our invoice. The VAT percent is set for 10%, and notice the amount's calculated at 9.09. The VAT type we're going to leave as exclusive, and expended from fund we're going to have selected. Now, when I go to the Invoice Lines tab, notice that we have a price for each item, and then we have a total price. That total price, if we look at the VAT note here, that's actually a very important note, it lets us know that approximately $2.27 was included in this total price. And that's because we've selected inclusive as our VAT type. It's telling Alma that do not change any of these prices. That $100 that we had on the invoice amount includes tax, so it's including the tax in each invoice item. And notice that it is prorated, the amount's prorated based on the amount of each item. So $2.27 was included for this $25 item. $2.27 was also included for this $25 item, and for the $50 item, approximately $4.55 was included in that total price. And if we go back to the Summary tab, note that this, again, this total amount includes tax. Let's go back to the slides, and we're going to look at our second scenario here. Again, it's the same situation where we have an invoice with a total amount of $100, a tax of 10%. We have 3 invoice lines, 2 invoice lines that are each $25 and 1 for $50. Now, what we're going to do is leave the VAT type at inclusive, so this total price of $100 or total amount of $100, that includes tax. But this time we're going to uncheck the expended from fund checkbox. And let's see how Alma handles that situation. So I'm going to uncheck expended from fund. And this time when I go to the Invoice Lines tab, there are a couple of things to take note of now. First of all, there's a separate line called Adjustment, and that's because we unchecked the expended from fund checkbox. So because we unchecked that box, we now have the tax, $9.09, as a separate line item. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the total price for each item is actually less. And that's because, as it's indicated in the VAT note here, approximately in this case for the $25 item, $2.27 was included in this adjustment line. So the total price for the item it goes down a little bit because the tax that was included in that total price is now actually separated out into an adjustment line. Same thing for this other $25 item. Approximately $2.25 was included in this adjustment line. And same thing for this $50 item. $4.55 was included in that adjustment line. Going back to the slides, we'll take a look at a third example here. And it's the same situation, same scenario with the $100 total amount. This time, we are going to select the VAT type of exclusive, and we're going to select the expended from fund checkbox. So with the VAT type of exclusive, that means this total amount of $100 does not include tax. We're going to be adding tax on top of that. The expended from fund checkbox, that just means that VAT amount is applied to each invoice line. So we'll see it actually in each invoice line. So going back to our example invoice, I'm going to go back to the Summary tab. And this time we're going to change the VAT type to exclusive. Notice that the amount calculates a little bit differently than the VAT type of inclusive. And we're going to check the expended from fund checkbox. All right, so we're letting Alma know that because we've selected exclusive, we're going to be adding tax on top of the $100 for the invoice. And expended from fund, meaning that we are going to apply that VAT amount to each invoice line. So now if I go to the Invoice Lines tab, just to see how that looks. Notice that for each item, the total price is actually a little bit more than the actual price of the item. And that's because that total price now includes tax. And we're telling Alma that the tax will be added on top of the original invoice amount. So in this case, instead of $25, approximately $2.50 was included for the total price of this particular item. For the second item, the second $25 item, same thing. And for the third $50 item, approximately $5 was included in the total price. Again, this is all prorated based on the cost of the item. So we have tax built in now. We've added tax on top of the original price, and so that's now reflected in the total price. What we would need to do, actually, if I go back to the Summary tab, is notice the total invoice lines amount is now $110, so I would probably need to update this invoice amount to be $110 also. So that is the third scenario. The fourth scenario we'll take a look at, again, same example with our $100 invoice with a tax of 10%. This time we're going to be using exclusive. So meaning that we're going to be adding tax on top of the invoice amount. But this time we're going to uncheck or not select that expended from fund checkbox. And we'll see how Alma behaves. So this time we're going to keep our VAT type as exclusive. I'm going to uncheck the expended from fund checkbox. Now when we look at invoice lines, notice that we have an adjustment line of $10. And that's because we've now separated the tax out into its own invoice line. Note, though, that in our VAT note, approximately $2.50 for each of the $25 items was applied or included in this adjustment. And for the $50 item, approximately $5 was included in that adjustment line. I'm going to look at two more examples here, this time with line exclusive. So we're going to have the example here where we have line exclusive selected for the VAT type, and we're going to check the expended from fund checkbox. So line exclusive meaning that the total amount includes tax. The invoice lines do not include tax. And then expended from fund meaning that the VAT amount is applied to each invoice line. So I'm just going to go back to the summary tab. And we're going to change the VAT type to line exclusive and check the expended from fund checkbox. All right. And this time when I go to the invoice lines tab, it now shows the tax applied to each invoice line. So we'll see that there's in the VAT note, again, that will be a very important note to take a look at. It tells us how much was included in the total price. So we'll see that this $25 item now has a total price of $27.50. And our last scenario that we'll take a look at, we are still going to keep with the line exclusive option in the VAT type, but this time we're going to uncheck expended from fund. So this time meaning that the VAT tax will be added as a separate line item in the invoice. So going back to Alma, I'm going to go back to the summary tab. And this time I'm going to uncheck expended from fund, but we're going to leave the VAT type as line exclusive. Now when I go to invoice lines, note that there is an adjustment line item for the tax that will be applied rather than taking it out of each individual price, or each individual item rather. This actually brings us to the end of our session. So just to summarize what we've covered here, we looked at the options for adding taxes into invoices, so you'll ultimately know how to enter taxes that appear on an invoice. So we looked at the 6 different tax options here. Inclusive, meaning the total invoice amount includes the tax already. Exclusive, meaning the total invoice amount excludes tax, and tax needs to be added on top of the total invoice amount. Line exclusive, that means that the total invoice amount includes tax, but line items in the invoice do not include tax. Expended from fund, that checkbox, that determines if tax is prorated and distributed to each invoice line, or if tax is added as an entirely separate line item. VAT per invoice line, that's where tax is determined on an invoice line by line, basically, on a line-by-line basis. So the VAT or tax is added separately to each invoice line item. And I know I didn't get a chance to really talk about that much. I want to go back to the invoice here. This is, again, that VAT per invoice line. There is some configuration that's needed for that. But once that configuration happens, you would click on Actions Edit for each invoice line, or you could click on Add Invoice Line. I'm just going to click on Edit here. and you will see a section, I believe it's right before the funding section, for VAT. So that's where you can indicate the VAT or tax for this particular item. And click on Cancel. And the last option was the governmental vendor use tax, and that handles use tax on library items and ensures that tax payments are handled separately from regular invoice charges, and they go directly to the government. For more details on the tax options that are available for invoices, please do feel free to consult the Alma Acquisitions Guide documentation. In particular, there's a section on creating invoices that you'll want to take a look at. And there are also other VAT calculation examples in the documentation as well. This documentation is available using the online help within Alma, or it's also available as a PDF file in the Ex Libris Documentation Center. Thanks for viewing this presentation.